So I'm just going to set up this next section. Hopefully you all found the speakers to be thought-provoking, and we'll have good discussions in our breakouts based on some of the things that they teed up and that we will now discuss in this next session as well. So again, as Matsumi mentioned, we're trying to kind of build on what we discussed in our last retreat, skating closer and closer to the finish line here for the preclinical studies and anticipating the next phase when these products will go into humans and be ready for commercial, or be readied at least for commercialization. Obviously, we, I think, have been stressing, hopefully from the start, the clinical adoption is the end game here. And many of the steps that were milestones we're realizing now are critical steps along the way, but they at most buy you permission to play. At the end of the day, we need to have products that will actually be used in people and be successful commercially when they're adopted by dentists, in most cases, who will be the end users. And we have some cases, which we'll talk about, where the patient or the parent even will play an important role there as well. So thinking about that, I wanted first to share that I had a friend who's worked in product development for almost 40 years in this space, who joined our first retreat and had not been to one since yesterday, and was just blown away with how much the ITP leaders have matured, not only in their ability to talk about the science, which was impressive from the start, but in their grasp of what really is necessary for clinical adoption to be achievable, the language and the sophistication and their ability to begin to tell this really compelling story that both Jean and Marty stressed has advanced dramatically. And we should all feel really, really good about that, really proud of that. So what we're going to talk about next will be three elements that will be critical to that pitch deck and to your plans to secure investors. The first will be a discussion of regulatory strategies, which we've had lots of discussion and lots of great support around many aspects of regulatory, including those that are more focused on preclinical studies, GLPs, and all the quality measures you have to get, mechanisms and systems you have to get in place. This is more focused on the end game regulatory strategy, what it is that's going to, again, allow your product to be out there on the market with a label that will support the kind of commercial adoption that you're hoping to achieve. So the regulatory strategies discussion will be led by Kay Fuller, and we'll have some examples of projects, ITPs, that have stories to tell there, and I think lessons that have important lessons that have been learned. Then we'll talk about market assessment. Again, it's been engineered into our resource center and system and support from the start to get projects and ITP leaders talking to end users about the real clinical needs. And many of them have made important adjustments based on what they learned from those end users early enough that they were really able to design clinical studies and this pre-market phase or this preclinical phase quite differently based on the market assessment. So we'll have some examples of that. And then the third session, and that will be led by Francine Berkey. The third section will be on user handling trials. And this is a service that our resource center has really come to more recently. And I think there are several projects that now realize this is something that they could would definitely benefit them. You know, it's kind of as close as you can get to a clinical experience when you're not yet ready for prime time to get your products into the hands of clinicians and have them work on pig jaws or in any setting where they can begin to actually handle the product as they will when it is provided to them for either a study or for sale. In so many cases, and I think Marty and Jean gave lots of examples of that, the ease of use of a product is a critical selling point. And with any certainly device, and many of our regenerative products have at least a device component, you can only engineer so much into the product itself. You can do everything possible with design controls and try and make it as easy to use as possible. But at the end of the day, the success of that product also depends very heavily on the surgeon who you hand the product to. And their ability to use it, make it work, will certainly affect greatly their likelihood of adopting the product and benefit to the patient. So handling trials, we've had some now experience in two very different settings we'll talk about in that session. And I think we'll see more of that. And there are some projects that have already, said, please, we need to do more of these. And ideally, frankly, the sooner the better, because, you really want to get handling feedback when you still are in a position where the things you learn can be integrated into design changes, and that may impact preclinical studies, as we're learning from some of our ITPs. So that will be the program from this point until our next, well, I guess we have some breaks built in along the way, but until our breakout sessions. So without further ado, I think I will now turn this over, if that's all right with you, Matsumi, to Kay, or do you want to set that up?
No, this is perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. So Kay Fuller, take it away.
Thank you, Jeannie. Can everyone see the screen?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jeannie, for that great queuing up of this next session. Are we ready? Everyone can see?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, great. So as Jeannie mentioned, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the regulatory elements of your pitch deck, and I won't take too much time. And I wanted to just give you a quick overview of what we're going to go over. A few pitch tips, business model overview. I really think this could be a helpful tool that some of us may not know about. And how is your one pager? And I find that if you've got a good one pager, it makes preparing your pitch deck much easier. Give you some examples of typical layout and content that goes into a pitch deck, and then a few slides towards the end that give some examples of how to succinctly speak about your regulatory pathway in as few words as possible, including the preclinical development, the clinical, and then the ask and use of funds related slides. That other people may cover that as well, but just don't forget you're asking typically for money. So to first pitch tips that I have for you, remember, I think both Jean and Marty spoke about making sure that you remember you're telling a story. You need to know the audience that you're pitching to, and that audience can change, whether it's friends and family sometimes it's angel investors, sometimes it's VC investors even, or grant related organizations. So make sure you tailor your pitch each time for the particular audience. And you want to really create an emotional connection. That's, again, what Marty was speaking about around the storytelling is really important. Keep your pitch very short. Typically, many VCs and angel teams just want a 10-minute pitch. That typically includes 14 or less slides. And how do you prepare and disseminate a pitch in 10 minutes? Well, the key is to write your script out, time your script, and don't read from your slides. And you really want to use your slides to highlight the main points of your script, if you will, of what your story is. And then the most important thing probably is practice, practice, practice. You can get to Carnegie Hall by practicing, 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 but to get money, you have to practice even a bit more. So let's talk just briefly about business models. There are different types of business models, but this is probably the most common one that's used. At least a lot of VCs want to see this. And this is really known as the business model canvas. And it includes different elements of your whole business organization, from the customer, your value proposition, what are your sales channels, customer relationships, revenue streams, key activities. That's the key piece I'm going to speak about a little bit in more detail. And who are your key resources, key partners, and then your cost structure. So this this is a really cute little cartoon, but when you start to fill in these elements, it becomes a little bit more challenging. So you want to make sure that you, if you're going to use this model, go ahead and populate it to match your company and what your company business model stands to be. You may not know all these elements yet, but it's a good idea to start thinking about them, at least from my experience. And so, again, I mentioned the key activities. Where does the regulatory and clinical elements, where do they really fit into this business model? It's really in the key activities. And I'll speak to that in just a moment. But here's an example of a business model canvas for Medtronic, one of the largest medical device companies in the world. Notice they have a very concise value proposition. They know who their customers are, who are their key customer relationships, what are their sales channels, marketing channels, who are their key resources, key partners, and key activities, and the cost structures and revenue streams. So again, I'm going to focus on the key activities element. Notice it's got research and development, technology development, design, engineering, and manufacturing. All of those things are all regulated, of course. And so that's kind of how we're going to zoom into this part of your business model canvas in just a moment. But before you really get started on your pitch deck, you may want to go ahead and start trying to fit everything you know into one page. So create a one-pager that you can disseminate to potential investors. They often will ask for a one-pager. These are just some examples, some templates for how do you succinctly put all that information on one page. Graphics help, and so forth. So these are just a few examples of a one-pager. And I found that putting together a pitch after you've got your one-pager succinctly put together, it makes your preparing your pitch much easier. So what goes into a pitch deck? Typically, again, if we're going to keep it to 14 or less slides, you'll have a title page. You want to have right up front, what is the problem? What's the unmet clinical need that you're solving? And you also typically want to have some kind of some evidence that you validated the clinical problem, that you know this problem really exists. And then mentioning, probably most importantly, what is your solution? What is your technology? And is it patented, or at least have you applied for patents? Typically investors want to know that. So next one, why now? What is your secret sauce? Why is your company so special? You may have a demo or an animation you want to show. Market opportunity, I think that will be talked about briefly in a few moments with, I think Francine's going to speak about that. Your revenue and business model, competitive analysis. Typically that's a heat map. And then what current traction? What have you done thus far? And then what's your go-to-market strategy? Financials, the ask and use of funds. Who's your team? Go ahead. It's okay to brag a little about your team. You guys are really talented. So let the potential investors know that. And then in your thank you slide, make sure you include your contact information. But for today on the regulatory side, where does regulatory fit into all of this? It's really around your current traction and your go-to-market overview information. And I'm also going to speak about the ask and use of funds, because obviously much of this money will go into doing all the validation work that goes into getting your marketing clearance. So again, I mentioned the business model canvas, the key activities. For purposes of today, these are the key activities that typically feed into, excuse me, your regulatory elements on your pitch deck around the preclinical and clinical elements and the ask and use of funds. So I'm going to show just briefly a few examples of ways to depict the product development process and where you are in the, excuse me, continuum as you're depicting that to your investors. So, excuse me, I'm calling them steps instead of phases and gates so that we're not confused. But basically, are you in the planning stage? Are you in the development stage? Are you getting ready to finally do some verification related work? Are you in the preclinical validation work where you typically will build units for engineering bench testing And then you'll start ramping up for your GMP unit builds for your GLP animal studies. And then you'll run the GLP and end up with a final report from that GLP work. And then you'll feed into preparing your product for use for your clinical studies, prepare and submit your IDE to the FDA, and run the trial, and then create the final report. And at this point, you typically are starting to work on your pre-launch activities as well. And then you end up with your regulatory marketing permissions. And these are typical things that we would go through to get a 510(k) cleared, if you will. You're also going to be working on these market launch activities before you have actual clearance. There's a lot that goes into that. I'm sure Francine may speak to that. And then there's always post-market surveillance that we have to deal with. So this is an easy way to depict in one slide what you have to do and maybe where you are in the roadmap, if you will. Another way to do it, this is maybe a more customary way, is to depicting it through this phase gate approach. And I won't spend time on this. Everyone's lived through some of this. Most of us are somewhere in this development stage here, which is really the valley of death, as we're all learning. So how do you depict in one slide, you know, an overview of your company and how are you going to spend the money? Well, one way is to depict, this is our current ownership of our company. If you haven't raised any money, you're only 100% owned by the founders. And then eventually the seed money will start breaking down. This ownership ratios will change. And then here's your ask, $2 million. Here's how we're planning to use the money. 30% R&D, hiring some people, and the regulatory 20%, and the clinical studies maybe 40%. This is just an example of how to depict that very succinctly. There are other ways to do it, and I've got a quick example of a relatively simple 510(k) device in just 2 or 3 slides, how you depict. It's an easy regulatory pathway. Investors really want to know that if you have a 510(k) pathway, they're very excited typically that it's going to be a pretty straightforward and de-risked investment. And if you don't need clinical data, please highlight that, because again, that reduces the cost and the risk to bringing your product to market. You might want to also make sure you're focusing on the reimbursement strategies. I think everyone in the ITP program is aware of this. For this particular type of product, it already had the CMS codes that exist so that reimbursement is capable and easy. And then this yields a speed to market launch. And then another way to depict where you are in all of the development work is breaking it into basically the 5 key development stages. And at each tranche where you will be for the first pile of money, the second tranche of money, and potentially the third tranche of money. And so try to make this as clean and succinct as you can, and try to include your estimates on when things will be completed, such that the investor in one quick snapshot can see where their money is going and how soon that they will get the product on the market, which eventually will lead to hopefully some revenue for the company. This is a way to depict in a little bit more granular detail where you are in the development process, which gets into, it depicts all the 5 phases, but it also allows you to show what's completed. We've done all of these things, we've completed, and now we're in development. We need $700,000 for all of the verification related development work. And then we move into full validation, performance validation, conducting the bench testing, conducting the GLP studies, and eventually submitting the 510(k) and then receiving the 510(k) clearance to launch. So that's a very simple way to depict the entire process with some granular detail. And probably the one thing that sometimes young teams forget is, don't forget about your exit strategy. I know the previous speakers mentioned this. It might be a good idea to have 2 exit strategies in case you're trying to do a pre-revenue acquisition about 5 or 10 years ago, that was a very common model in the medical device space. However, investors are and target companies that might acquire you, your potential strategic partners, typically are waiting. They don't want to acquire you just that you have a 510(k) cleared, but rather they typically want to see some market traction, and they would like to see that you've actually got some revenue. So this is an early exit strategy. And then preparing, we would love to exit early, but we're also prepared as a team to go the long haul and demonstrate revenue 1 to 3 years. And so that's just a very quick way to depict that. What could be easier? Thank you.
Great, Kay. Thank you so much for that great presentation. Now what we would like to do is to have two of our ITPs share their experience and story around regulatory strategies as related to fundraising. First up, we have the Regendogel team of Dr. Louise Bertassoni and Dr. Pam Yellick. I think you should be able to share your screen. There we go.
There we go. I was muted. Yeah. Hello, everybody. Thanks so much, Mitsumi and Kay, for this opportunity to share with you a little bit. And, you know, we're hoping that our regulatory strategy is pretty straightforward, which, you know, we've worked with Kay substantially on to get here. So let me just try to forward. Oops, sorry. Okay, so what we're hoping is that this will be a straight 510(k) pathway. And again, I'm speaking for myself and also for Louise Bertassoni, Scott Olson, our CEO, and then Anissa is also one of our team members. So again, we're hoping that this is a pretty straightforward 510(k) pathway where we've identified our legally marketed predicate. We are convinced that our device will have the same intended use and the same technological characteristics or differences that aren't going to raise new or different questions. So Kay has really carefully advised us that although we're proposing this as a, you know, kind of a novel, you know, first in kind, but it's not a first in kind, regenerative pulp regeneration therapy, very different from the silicate cements that are currently used to fill a tooth once an endodontic treatment has been performed and essentially killing the tooth. We're hoping to regenerate it, but we're not going to pitch it that way to the FDA, of course, because we don't want to be flagged as something different. We want to be able to use these predicates. And so this is kind of our timeline that we've been advised for on the right-hand side for getting this through FDA approval. And right now we're procuring GMP grade materials and to conduct our GLP studies, which we haven't conducted yet. And we're hoping for the FDA submission later this year or 2023. So again, our preliminary regulatory assessment is as an FDA 510(k) class 2. We have 3 predicates using a stacked predicate approach. Again, this was highly recommended by Kay. We have the material Biodentine, and then which is one of the bioactive is the word that they use to describe their material. They received FDA approval in earlier this year, or was it last summer? Earlier last summer, I guess. And they did not need human clinical trials, so we are hoping that we will not need them either, although we will need first in human trials, of course, for clinical adoption. And then we have a predicate device 2, Wishbone HA, which is a regenerative bone material, and then BioOS. So we have talked a lot about whether we need a pre-sub meeting or not with the FDA. And again, our decision is just that it's a pretty straightforward, should be 510(k) pathway that typically doesn't need a pre-sub with the FDA, and that in fact, it could raise new questions that we would have to address. If we did meet with the FDA, they might come up with other things that we might have to, hoops that we might have to jump through. And since those pre-sub meetings are not binding, that it would be worth just to focus our efforts on submitting the 510K and getting a definitive answer from the FDA. And then finally, what we're doing right now is working on our design control process, again, with MDRS and Kay and team for this phase 1 concept requirement and planning, and the phase 2 design, feasibility and development. I know you can read all of these, and I know we're supposed to limit this to a 5-minute presentation. And then continuing on to phase 3, design verification and then phase 5 for the design transfer and commercialization. So I guess that's it. And Louise and team are available for questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Pam. I think what I might do in the interest of time, maybe if folks have questions for the team, either connect with them separately or maybe discuss those topics at your breakout session where you have more time in a smaller setting to talk about those. Thanks again, Pam. Next up, we have Andrew Brown with his Emergence dental hat on this time, and we'll ask him to discuss his experience as related to regulatory strategies for pitch decks and fundraising.
Yeah, thank you, Mitsumi. So what I thought I'd do is share really just the 2 slides in our standard go-to pitch deck that we use to convey our regulatory strategy and our preclinical development plans. And for context, who we have been really pitching to for the stage we're at are angel networks, individual angels, and some local and regional investor groups / economic development groups. So almost all of these investors have a little bit of background in the biomedical space. They typically have done some deals in the medical device space, but very few of them have expertise in dental, in implantable biomaterials. And so they're really looking to us and to our core team and development partners to justify what we're telling them. And so specific to the regulatory strategy, what we've found is there hasn't been a lot of back and forth on the regulatory path and the regulatory strategy itself. Because these devices are so specific, because the material's new, these potential investors do really just seem to be looking at, does this seem reasonable? What's the strategy for confirming this regulatory path and your preclinical development plans? Whether that be with the FDA through some pre-submission mechanisms, or with experts that have done these studies and developed these products before. And really importantly, who's helping you to actually get there? Who are those regulatory consultants, and have they been bringing things through the dental branch? Have they been working on magnesium? Did they just come from a company that was developing these products? That seems to come up a lot too. But we really lay out our regulatory strategy like you saw if you saw our presentation yesterday, in a pretty straightforward way that fits with a lot of the other aspects of our pitch deck related to our clinical launch and how we describe solving that unmet clinical need. And what our regulatory strategy, this regulatory driven product development strategy attempts to do is show that we're working to get to the generation of clinical data as quickly as possible, because that's probably one of the biggest challenges we have in securing investment and creating a compelling story around getting a return on investment for these early stage investors is just how long of a preclinical development pathway there is for these materials. So not as much kind of really kicking the tires on the regulatory strategy itself, but where the investors that we've been pitching to seem to really dig into is that preclinical development plan. And the folks that know about implantable materials, know about regenerative materials in the dental space specifically, know that these preclinical development timelines are really expensive, but also just really long. And so what they hear when they hear we have to do an animal study that's going to take 18 months from initiation to submitting our FDA de novo package is that's 18 months longer that I'm going to have to wait for a return on my investment compared to some surgical tool that might not require GLP large animal studies, or at least isn't going to require a 6 or 8 month final endpoint. So where we've built a lot of our backup slides is not necessarily on the regulatory strategy, but helping to show how this long and expensive preclinical development plan is going to answer questions that our future customers are going to be interested in, how these preclinical studies are going to answer questions that future investors are going to be interested in, and how all of that relates to the materials and procedures that folks are currently using now. So that's really where a lot of the back and forth with potential investors has focused, over the last 6 months that we've been getting ready for and performing this current raise, and how we've tried to really design the story around what we've identified as one of the biggest hurdles we have to overcome, which is that long preclinical development path leading up to our FDA submissions. And that's it. Happy to chat more about it in the breakout session.
Great, Andrew. Thank you for that presentation. So what we're going to do now is to take a quick 5-minute, or I guess 7-minute now, break before we go into the next session. So the format will be very similar, where Francine will chat for about 10-15 minutes about the market assessment, and we'll have a couple ITP teams kind of give their perspective, and then we'll have another similar session following that on user handling. So we'll be on break until 1:20 Eastern. Thanks, everybody. Okay, welcome back, everybody. It's about 1:20, so we'll get started. I'll hand things over to Francine.
Thank you, Matsumi. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I think the sessions so far have just been great. I hope you all are finding them valuable. I certainly have felt like they were really helpful. So let's hope we can keep that going and stay on a roll today. So I think Jeannie did a great job of kind of setting up why these 3 sessions are happening and what our purpose was there. So hopefully that all makes sense. I do not have a formal presentation for you. I do have some sort of introductory remarks about the market assessment piece. And then what I'd like to leave more of the time for are the 2 ITP teams who have agreed to talk a little bit about their market assessment process, why and how it was important to them, and how they're integrating it into their message going forward, because I think that will be really valuable. So at the Resource Center, when we talk about market assessment, we really talk about it in 2 ways, a qualitative kind of way and a quantitative way. And the qualitative piece is what many of you have done with me and the Avenues Company. Others have found other means for doing what might be called voice of the customer or customer discovery. There have been everything from interviews to focus groups. Some people have tapped into the I-Core process, but I consider those all to be qualitative approaches to market assessment. Because what you're trying to get to with the qualitative piece is what both Jean and Marty were talking about when they said the place to start is in describing how the product meets an unmet need for the clinician, and other things that have to do with clinical and market dynamics that you can discover in an in-depth conversation that are really important to you in defining your indication, understanding what some of the barriers to adoption might be, and how you might get around some of those challenges, understanding who the competition is. And it can also be a good way to do what Marty called bottom-up assessment of your market, because he's right that dentists self-report on how many procedures they do is kind of an inaccurate science, but it is a good bottom-up approach, because if a clinician tells you, oh yeah, I do 5 or 6 of those a week, as opposed to 5 or 6 a month or 2 or 3 a month, you do at least start to get some proportional ideas about numbers of procedures and other categories. So it's a bottom-up way to do that. You can also ask clinicians in these qualitative experiences about things like important outcome measures that should be integrated into your clinical studies. What's going to be important to your future customers to know about the product in order to adopt it. So there's all of that qualitative information that provides you with a lot of what Marty and Jean pointed out is important to your story and the credibility of your story. Plus there's being able to say, you talk to these people, right? We talk to clinicians and this is what we heard, and you build your credibility in that way as well. And apart from the qualitative piece, then there's also a quantitative piece, and I don't intend to talk much about that today. Andrew and his team at Cyvello have done some really good work with many of the teams in trying to get that top-down data, understanding how many procedures are done and how to break that out. And that's important to have in your pitch deck too. But I think, as our keynote speakers pointed out, those numbers you have to be really, really careful about, because you can build false expectations. If you look at the number of patients, for instance, or general dentists and then try to extrapolate how many of them will use your product, it starts getting further and further. You're getting orders away from the real data to what are the possibilities. So it's important to balance those two things. The other thing that I wanted to really emphasize with you all, besides both of those pieces of our market assessment being important, is how important integration is, right? So Kate just talked about your regulatory strategy, and we all know that's really important. But if it's not integrated with your marketing and commercialization strategy, you will have a really difficult time producing a pitch that is consistent and believable. And I'll just give you one example. So we just heard both Andrew and Pam talk about their team's approach to the presenting your regulatory strategy. If you are going for a 510K, and that is your regulatory strategy, then you tell the investors that your marketing strategy, what's going to be key to adoption, is convincing clinicians that what you have is new, different, innovative. They've never seen anything like it before in terms of how it works or how it handles or the outcomes that it produces. Then you have an inherent contradiction in your story, right? And so a de novo would help, right? Because then you're able to say it's a strategy that allows us some of the 510K flexibility, but we still have more work to do because we have to prove that it's different than the predicates, which there aren't any. So when you're doing the pitch deck, to have that internal consistency of the message and have the story be believable, you have to integrate what you're saying and doing from a regulatory point of view, with a market assessment point of view, with what you present to them for a commercialization plan. So those are all really important things to be thinking about moving forward as you turn a lot of this into your pitch decks, which we hope you're going to be able to do going forward using some of what we've talked about today. So we chose 2 teams, ITP teams, to sort of participate in this session based on the fact that we thought they had either a unique experience or learned something important from their market assessment process, the qualitative piece primarily, that has influenced their product development efforts, their strategic direction, what they will say to partners that they need or investors about how they intend to move forward. So I think on the agenda, Matsumi had Will Ginobili and his team listed first. So Will, I think you have some team members to introduce who are going to actually be helping you with this today. So I'll let you get started and only chime in if you need me.
Actually, thanks, Francie. Actually, I'm sorry to interrupt. I think we'll have one team go first.
Oh,
Sorry about that. One, are you on?
Yep, I'm on.
sorry, Juan. I didn't know you were up first.
It's all right. It's that I teach class in 2 minutes and Matsumi's doing me the favor of swapping me forward. So
Oh, will your students wait for you?
yeah, they will. They have to. They don't have a choice.
Okay, good. Okay, Juan, if you could just share a little bit about how the market assessment worked for your team, how you've integrated what you got from it, and share that with us, we'd appreciate it.
Sure thing. So I'll explain the process by which we came to pivot our indication based on our market assessments. And I think you guys are seeing my slides now. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, great. So we initially targeted VitalDent, which is this vital pulp therapy, to adults because we knew 1 in 4 Americans has had a root canal therapy treatment. And just based on personal experience and talking to other individuals, people were very interested in having a vital therapy available. We also knew from the primary literature that teeth on average across the spectrum that have gone root canal therapy with these non-vital materials are going to fail within 20 years. And that there's evidence of infection periapically on average by 10 years. And there is a high rate of acute failure overall. So we formulated the initial VitalDent approach to replace the conventional sealers and points that dentists put in with an injectable hydrogel and a similar point, so that it was easily translatable to their normal workflow and they would be familiar with. This was back in 2017, we had this idea. And it wasn't until 2020 where we formed our first market analysis in depth with the avenues in Francine. And there we discovered, you know what? The dentists don't really believe us in these failure rates. Endodontists perceive that success is very high. And amongst the general dentists versus endodontists, which you can split those practices in terms of performing endodontic procedures, general dentists about 70% of root canals versus the endodontist 30%. General dentists might say, yeah, you know, our procedures are 90 to 95% successful, while the endodontist would say 96. And endodontists would say, we don't really see any acute failure at all. While the general dentist would say, you know, we are seeing some people coming in at 2 or 3 years, but they just didn't buy it. They were entrenched, just like we heard earlier today, in their mode of thinking that, nah, this is not necessary. So then we had to sit back and pivot. Well, how do we target this procedure? And that's where we had the idea of going with pediatric indications, because there's no good solution there. So we went back with Francine and performed a second set of customer discovery, where we realized, look, the pediatric dentist is complaining about this. The tooth is coming discolored. Their procedures pretty much leave a dead tooth. They're just buying time to stabilize the tooth until they can come back later when the child has finished growing and then retreat again. They felt that having a vital pulp therapy was actually of high value. And we then performed our market analysis, and compared to those 15 million procedures per year that take place for root canal therapies in adult, the child population is smaller in total volume, but we felt that this adolescent pulpectomy was the greatest need that these pediatric dentists identified. The endodontists and general dentists validated that in our customer discovery. And we decided this is the target indication to enter the marketplace, and then later we can expand. So that's it on how our pivot came about.
Thanks, Juan. Yeah, and I would just add that, you know, as Juan indicated, this took us a couple iterations of hearing what we heard the first time and then having to say, okay, we maybe need to step back and center based on what we were hearing from the clinicians and make those changes. And that's why it's called product development, right? Because you're in a development process. It is iterative. And it is sometimes necessary to make those kinds of pivots. And if you're making those because you know that's what customers want, you should tell investors that, right? Because you have de-risked something about the project that they would have had to find out the hard way if they invested in you before you had done that work. So it's not just what Juan's team found out, but making sure that investors understand that they did make this change and why, and present it as a positive in terms of their ability to adapt and do things according to success criteria. So, okay, Juan, well, we know you need to get to class, so we'll let you go.
Before I go, let me just add that we were lucky. We had developed the technology as a platform, so we really didn't have to redesign for the pediatric indication, but that's not always the case. You know, pediatric medicine, things are smaller and there's a lot higher risk tolerance. So we fared well. Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, thanks, Juan.
Thank you.
Okay, Will, sorry about the misstep.
Oh, no problem. So, well, thanks, Francine, for the opportunity to be in this session on market assessment. Our team has really appreciated having the collaboration with the Resource Center, actually on two different technologies. two different drugs, one romosozumab, the other one abaloparatide. These are two bone anabolic agents with potential for regenerating bone in the oral cavity. And so what you'll see is some examples of support that we've received from the Resource Center and the avenues on market assessment as it relates to this area of medical dental integration. And so I'd like to introduce Dr. Jessica Latimer, who was involved in both of these projects. She's a Doctor of Medical Sciences student and a resident in periodontology at the Harvard School of Dental Medicine. So Jessica.
Thank you, Dr. Ginobili, for your kind introduction. Today, I'm really excited and pleased to be able to have the opportunity to discuss with all of you how market assessment during our ITP projects have led to the development of a really unique dual referral model for medical and dental integration. So, our ITP research overall aims to assess the efficacy of a bone anabolic drug used in osteoporosis therapy to reconstruct bone in the jaws prior to dental implant placement. The first step in our market assessment process was identifying unmet needs shared by the medical and dental communities. We know that osteoporosis and periodontitis are both highly prevalent diseases involving bone resorption in adults, and they share common risk factors. Notably, 1 in 3 women over the age of 50 are at risk for debilitating fragility fractures associated with osteoporosis and may also be at a greater risk for tooth loss. While many osteoporosis patients could benefit from dental implant placement to replace missing teeth, this patient population is also considered to have an elevated risk for implant complications due to potentially compromised alveolar bone quality. So in order to estimate the true target population for our technology, we performed a market segmentation analysis in collaboration with the Avenues Company, where we first identified the total addressable market, which includes approximately 2 million patients who receive dental implants in the US annually. Of this population, the serviceable addressable population includes approximately 50% of postmenopausal women who may be affected by osteoporosis. And then using this information, what we consider the serviceable obtainable population, who would be the consumers for our product, this was determined to be at least 1 million patients per year. So these are individuals who are affected by osteoporosis and also require dental implant placement. And this population could potentially benefit from the bone anabolic therapy for osteoporosis timed strategically with their dental implant surgery. So as part of our market assessment, we also conducted interviews with key opinion leaders who were geographically distributed across the United States. And this included experienced dental surgeons in oral surgery and periodontology, as well as bone health specialists who routinely prescribe osteoporosis drugs to thousands of patients every year. And through these interviews, we identified a great opportunity for referrals between dentists and physicians, as well as immense potential for cooperation in medical assessments of bone health, preventive activities for patients, and active treatment. So we thus developed this dual referral model that draws upon the large existing referral base that is likely underutilized in both the medical and dental communities to increase opportunity to identify patients who are at risk for fractures due to low bone mass and who might benefit from our technology. And through interprofessional collaboration, we truly believe that physicians and dentists could use this model to effectively educate their patients about osteoporosis therapy, to increase skeletal bone strength and decrease fracture risk, as well as enhance alveolar bone to enable dental implant placement and restore oral function and oral health related quality of life. Overall, our market assessment supports the use of a dual referral model, and we believe the system for medical dental integration will help expand the market for our technology. In terms of our experience so far, this pitch was previously used with a different company in which we did not gain traction for the investigator-initiated study. However, our team very quickly pivoted and applied our concept to a different bone anabolic drug for osteoporosis, which we are currently studying with the support of the ITP program. And our dual referral model was received with great enthusiasm. So this just goes to show that while your market assessment and translational strategy for clinical adoption of a technology may not resonate with one group, it could be received very well by another. And so overall, in conclusion, with improved communication between professionals in medicine and dentistry, we believe a dual referral model does have great potential to increase access to therapy for patients, and most importantly, promote good health outcomes and oral systemic quality of life. Thanks so much for the opportunity to share our experience, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Jessica. Great job. We appreciate that. Matsumi, we do have a few minutes. Do we have time for any interaction, or do you want to defer that to the breakout groups this afternoon?
You probably have
Oh,
about
sorry, my mistake.
No, that's okay. Go ahead, Matsumi.
No, I was just gonna say we have about 5 minutes for discussion. If that might be too short, then we could definitely take it to the breakout room as well.
Does anyone have questions or clarification for Juan is gone, though I might be able to answer questions for him, but specifically for this team or in terms of this whole topic of market assessment in your pitch deck? Yes, Kay, please.
Thank you, Francine. Very, very good presentations. I'm very intrigued with this dual referral model. And I'm just wondering, do you think that the majority of the referrals will come from the MD, if you will, going to the dentist? Or do you think dentists are maybe on the front line of seeing potential osteoporosis in their patients and then referring them back to the MD for further treatment? Is it a split 50-50, or do you have a sense of, which clinician would be referring more frequently, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question. And based on the interviews with key opinion leaders, I mean, it does seem that the dental community is a little bit more open to the crosstalk and communication. And part of that is just because of time. Physicians are very limited on time, and that was a concern that popped up in discussions with both the physicians and the dentists, that was their experience. But I think that there is opportunity for us to increase the communication, maybe, participate in each other's conferences and educational experiences to be able to collaborate and promote a real bi-directional referral system. So that's kind of the impression that we have so far.
Thank you. That's great.
Thanks, Kay. Scott, you had a question?
Yeah, I did. So if you're going to be targeting both doctors who treat osteoporosis as well as dentists who are involved in the implants, how do you sort of manage to stay focused, I guess, and not have your marketing become twice as expensive and take twice as long?
So I think that it would really reduce time in some ways, because if you're directly communicating well with your physician, you should be able to stay on track with their dental plan. You'll receive medical clearance faster to actually be able to do the surgery. If you're actually in tune and staying updated on, when is the patient getting their scan? When are they starting osteoporosis therapy? When should I time my implant placement? When you can actually progress in your treatment plan as well. So I think that overall, in terms of moving forward with the patient care and also the overall medical dental plan, I think that it could be an efficient system, actually.
Okay, good. Well, thanks. I'm getting a message from Matsumi that we need to wrap up. So thanks everyone for your help.
Thank you.
And we'll see you in 5 minutes, I think, for the last session. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Okay, welcome back everybody. So it's 1:50 and we'll get started with our next session, which is focused on user handling trials. And I'll turn things over to Jeannie.
Thank you, Matsumi. So we touched on this already. The user handling trials are kind of the newest service that the Resource Center has been providing to some of our ITPs. And I think, in general, I want to talk about this in two ways. There's a formal user handling trial, and we'll have two examples of ITPs who have been involved with those. And I think, again, they have tremendous value. There's also something that I would call an informal user handling process that, most everyone, especially involved with a surgical device, who's a champion for that device, is doing as often as they possibly can. And I'll use an example of attending the recent, the first in-person perio meeting in a while with Andrew Brown, who was there. And Andrew is championing a device that's a surgical device that he was looking to get in the hands of some surgeons without a formal handling session. He had it in his pocket and he took every chance he could with appropriate IP in place and in some cases even confidentiality agreements, but to get that in the hands of some of the top surgeons doing procedures that he's targeting based on market assessments for large vertical ridge augmentations. And that's a handling trial. I mean, as long as you're there, not to sell, but to listen and to take that feedback into consideration, you are conducting a handling trial when you're doing that. One fun story to tell about a surgical device that I was involved with early in my career was a vascular graft replacement developed by W.L. Gore. And Bill Gore did his first user handling trial on a chairlift where he happened to be seated next to a leading cardiovascular surgeon. Asked him what he did for a living. The guy talked about a pig model that he was developing to test different vascular grafts, and Bill pulled his out of his pocket and said, "Want to test this?" And the rest is history. That's now a major business for Gore. So there's never a time like now to get your products into the hands of people who are going to be using it. And as I said earlier, with a surgical device, the surgeon brings an awful lot to that party. So getting their input early when you still have a chance to make changes is really important. The thing I would caution you against doing actually is thinking of these user handling trials, whether informal or formal, as primarily about getting customer endorsements. I mean, sure, we all love to hear good things about our children, but what you really want is somebody to tell you that if you really want your child to be a piano player, you might need to get a better piano teacher or something that will actually help you do something early enough that you can make a difference. So go there mostly to listen and learn, even if, of course, anytime that you're championing a project, you're transferring a certain amount of enthusiasm as well, and that's a good thing. So the formal process, when you're setting up these formal, and we've done now a few of these user handling trials, the thing I would suggest you try to do is, first of all, get it into a setting where you're involving people who are neutral. You don't want, we talked earlier about friends and family and crowdsourcing and funding, and it's great to get dentists to actually invest in your business. That's wonderful, but they should not be the people that are doing the user handling trial because they have a vested interest and they're not necessarily going to give you unbiased critical feedback, which is what you're really looking for. So populate the room with people who are credible, smart, but neutral people, honest people who will give you good feedback. And then create a setting which is as close to the clinical setting as possible. You're not ready yet, you're not able yet from a regulatory standpoint to get this product into the hands of clinicians placing it into patients, but a pig jaw comes pretty close in terms of soft tissue handling and bone defects for the right kind of product. That might be an excellent model to use. So try to get it into a situation that's as close to real world as possible. Create a setting and a situation and this can be facilitated. It's something that we've done for some teams where you're inviting critical feedback. You're making it easy. If they're faced with the inventors and people they like and they care about asking for feedback, it's hard for them sometimes to say bad things. These are really nice people and they want to make you feel good about your invention, but you really want to invite critical feedback early on because it will happen, it will be heard later and sometimes too late if you don't ask for it sooner. And with that in mind, timing is critical, and ideally do these user handlings early enough that you can make changes, but far enough along that they're handling something that resembles at least what they would see in a finished device. So that's sometimes a tough line to walk. I would suggest you can just do it multiple times, and sometimes you may not have a product that's quite right, but you're early enough to get really great feedback for making changes. Later on, even if your product and your packaging is pretty well set, the feedback can be used to influence your training manuals, your training requirements. Even if you're seeing a lot of technique sensitivity and getting good feedback about that, you may change your market plans because of it. So listen and make those adjustments based on what you learn. So I think with that, I'm going to now lean heavily into our ITPs for examples of what they've done with their user handling trials, the more formal trials, with two very different examples. The first will be Jessica Denoyer from Osteo talking about their device, which has a user handling component that actually involves parents and not just surgeons. So I think she's got a really interesting story to tell where user handling is super important. And then after that, we'll have our second presenter, and we should hopefully have some time for questions. So hold your questions till after the second speaker. So Jessica.
Thanks, Jeannie. I don't have a formal presentation either, so I'm just going to talk a bit. And I think maybe what I want to start off with is really driving home the importance of these usability studies, because in thinking about the pitch deck, at least for us, the usability study isn't something that has been directly built into our pitch deck, but the fact that we've done these studies is important as you're giving your pitch and answering questions, because at the end of the day, what the investor really cares about is that you're building a product that somebody will use. So, you can do your market assessment, you can make sure that you understand your unmet need and what indication you're going for, but if you ultimately develop a product that isn't what somebody is going to use, all of that has been for naught. And unfortunately, I have been involved with a startup in the past where the CEO at the time just refused to believe the feedback that we were getting consistently, that what we were doing didn't fit within the standard workflow of how people worked for this particular indication. And while I ultimately left the company because I just didn't feel that I could continue to be part of that, they did go and build the product, and they spent all of the money building the product, and they hired a rather large team and built infrastructure around ultimately going and commercially developing this product. And when they went to do that, nobody bought it. And ultimately the company unfortunately went under. So in our case, what we've done is we've built usability studies into our formal product development process in two different forms. One, more formative studies that we're doing earlier on, which while formal are a little more informal in that we're using them to, as Jeannie said, gauge issues that we may have with usability of our product at an early enough stage where we can then integrate our learnings and findings into subsequent prototypes before we actually freeze our design. And then we'll have a usability study later on when we're doing validation and all of the documentation around validation for our 510(k) clearance. That's more of a summative usability study that essentially will show that we've developed a product that will do what we said that it would do and can be used by surgeon and caregivers in the means in which it was intended. So maybe just to step back for a minute, our product is first an implant that will be placed in the OR by craniofacial surgeons, but the actual treatment takes place at home by parents. So our device is a distractor. The surgeon, does an osteotomy, puts the implant in, and then the child is sent home with parents who then, in today's world, have to take a screwdriver essentially and physically expand the device over time. We're trying to simplify that process for the caregivers. And while we're building in technology to ultimately make the process simpler, improve compliance and thereby improve outcomes, what we can't do is introduce difficulties and challenges in our attempt to make it simpler through technology that then make it difficult for the parents to do what they need to do. And so we've done a usability study with representative caregivers where we essentially had them simulate a distraction process on a child or a baby doll. In our case, where we had them have our driver and then follow what will be user prompts to guide them through the distraction process on a tablet, which is how we were envisioning that we would walk them through the distraction process. But even that was part of our usability study, because we could put the user interface on the driver itself versus a tablet. And so we were trying to gauge, by virtue of doing this, what was the easiest way for the caregiver to understand and follow our prompts and perform a successful distraction. Even right down to minutia, like where are buttons going to be on the driver as they're holding the child and holding the driver at the same time and trying to read prompts. So all of these things were critical for us to understand in the hands of the parents that would actually be doing these types of procedures. And it allowed us to nail down many elements of our design that had been up in the air. Like I said, is the user interface on the driver? Is it on a tablet? Is the button on the top of the driver or on the side of the driver? Things that may seem simple, but ultimately will be critical to making this what is not a emotionally easy process for these parents, at least a physically easy process for them. And so right now we're actually building on that and now planning and recruiting for a usability study with surgeons, so that as they go through the implantation process in the OR, while we're not changing their workflow in any meaningful way, they will have to do some of the steps a little bit differently because our technology. And so we again want to make sure that as they are implanting our product, that we're not introducing things that become burdensome to them in their OR workflow.
Thank you.
That's basically it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jessica. That's such an interesting story and such a user handling intensive development effort that you guys are leading. So the next team that's going to talk are RevBio, who have a bone grafting material. So again, something that will be used by dentists, mostly periodontist and oral surgeons. And I think we have both Alan Pollock, who directs their clinical research, and Rahul, who spoke with us yesterday here. Who is going to speak first? I'm turning this over to you, RevBio.
Thank you, Jeannie, and thank you, Jessica. I think that was extremely informative. So, in terms of the experience that we've had at RevBio, we've actually conducted both the types of the usability studies, the formative as well as the summative, and I feel like both of them are really important from the product development perspective, because early on we definitely need to know what we need to have our product sort of consist of in terms of not just the formulation that we want to go ahead with, but also in terms of the kit, what type of kit design is going to be viable for some of the surgeons, the size of the kit design, whether we need delivery syringe, things like that. So there are a lot of the key aspects that can be easily determined by conducting some of the formative studies. The summative studies, on the other hand, are extremely important because you're sort of further along in the developmental process. And now what you want to do is how close it is for the users to really be okay with the product, using it as like a final finished product. So the recent experience that we had for the summative user handling trial, which as Jeannie mentioned, is the formal trial, is basically to validate the product by the users based on the user needs as well, right? And that's essentially what we have, sort of try to do. And we conducted the user handling trial to essentially address, whether there are any sort of changes that are required for us to make, while we are such, sort of further along in our developmental process. The key aspects that we thought about while we were, designing this usability study was to have a concise and a precise model that's going to be helpful, and it's going to be a lot more representative to the actual clinical scenario. We also wanted to make sure that the questions that we're, asking users, if they will really lead to sort of informative, thoughts, that we bounce around, by which we can make some changes and some sort of adjustments to our final finished product. So these are sort of the key important criteria, that we had sort of in our mind, just to make sure that we are, really getting the most out of the user validation trial, that we want to conduct. The model is extremely critical because I feel like, especially in the dental bone grafting indication, the size of the defect, the model itself can make a huge difference. A small versus a big, defect can really cause difference in the performance of the product that you really want to, test. So having an appropriate model is absolutely key. In terms of the user validation questions, as I mentioned, we wanted to have them, sort of arranged in the way, in the way that it would drive thoughts. It would provoke thoughts for the users, just so that they can give us some kind of critical feedback, so we can go back and essentially make the changes that we need to. The other key aspect that we at RevBio sort of thought in mind was also to make sure that the users that we are deciding for a trial, they're essentially more diverse. And what I mean by that is they need to be a lot more diverse in terms of the demographics where they're coming from, in terms of their experience, whether they are like young users versus sort of more experienced users. Because again, getting ideas from both, can help you, sort of determine where you really want to take your final product. And
that's great, Rahul. I would add a couple of things. One is that we also wanted to be sure that we had a cross section of both periodontists and oral surgeons included, because they have very different approaches to these kinds of procedures. And further, when we were developing both the protocol and the questionnaires, we spent a lot of time with several end users, several experienced surgeons, so that we could design both the protocol and those questionnaires to really get to the kinds of issues and concerns that the final end users will have, that the surgeons out in the world, in clinical practice, will have to contend with. That it wasn't, you have a tendency, I think, to have kind of a closed mindset when you're working within this circle within the company, and we're so used to using it ourselves that it's easy to kind of lose track of the concerns that a first user would have. And so we made sure that we spoke with several people to get their feedback on how to design the surgical, quote unquote, aspects of the protocol, as well as the questionnaires and the kinds of concerns that the dentists might have when they're actually using the product. I don't have anything further to add. We were using this first meeting that we had last 2 months ago in February to kind of test out the system. We had again a cross section of surgeons amongst the 5. There were 3 periodontists, 2 oral surgeons, And we were using that as the test run to see how well it worked. Logistically, for a larger meeting that we plan on having in 2 months in June, where we're going from 5 to 15 surgeons that we're inviting.
Great, thank you very much. I think we do have time for a few questions. If anyone wants to raise their hands, if you have a question. Can you see hands, Mitsumi? I'm not seeing any.
No, I'm not either.
You know what, then we'll take those into the breakout session. I don't think anyone.
Andrew has a question.
Oh, who does?
Andrew.
Oh, Andrew. Andrew.
It was nice to hear both the presenters talk about the importance of getting a diverse group of people. And I think that's important too, even for the market assessments, you know, when you're just asking questions, because I think a lot of us start out with those like really closely held clinical advisors that often are practicing at the same spot or maybe even trained with the same oral surgeons, other surgeons. So I definitely echo that. I was wondering if either of you could share, you know, something really surprising that you found that was like different versus how oral surgeons versus periodontists were using your bone grafting technology, or Jessica, maybe like differences between plastic surgeons and oral surgeons or neurosurgeons that really surprised you.
I can maybe go first. I think one of the surprising things that I found was in our trial. So we basically had a trial with 5 surgeons, and in our trial, it was sort of surprising because one of the surgeons actually tried to mix our product, which is extremely unique. It is an adhesive bone graft. So they try to use our product with some of the existing like grafting products that's available in the market, which when you're developing a product, you never really think about that, oh my gosh, this is something that perhaps like an outside surgeon would also do. So just, the exercise of the user handling trial really is sort of an eye-opening for also the product development team, because there's so much that we can just learn from their methods, their, sort of practice, if you will, which can then be, brought back to the lab and, just to essentially figure out that, okay, then, maybe there are some additional tests that we need to perform just to account for some of the feedback that we get from the users, if this is what they were to do, which is outside of like the common practice that we would do, within like the company.
Yeah, thanks, Rahul. That's a great example. And having been at that user handling session, I mean, the allograft was put out as a control to sort of have them do the defects to see how much longer it took and that sort of thing. But of course, those of us who know surgeons know that they often like to create their own cocktails of grafts. So they immediately mixed it. And that was an example of one that I gave earlier, where it may not be possible to engineer that into your product, that it can't be, that somehow it becomes radioactive or disappears if it gets mixed, but you can take that into very serious consideration with training protocols and workshops and requirements. So it's something you really want to understand before you're out there on the market. So great example. Jessica, did you have one quick one, and then we'll wrap up here?
Yeah, sure. Quick one. Because we haven't done our surgeon study yet, we're just about to work on that. I can't really speak to the difference between plastic surgeons and neurosurgeons, for example. But I think one thing that we did find surprising with our caregiver study is I think our default was that if we had a tablet and a driver, that might be too many things for the caregiver to handle. And what we found is that they actually found that really easy and simpler when they're dealing with holding a child and providing the treatment and holding the driver than if they had to actually look at the driver itself for instructions, because they could just set the tablet on a table where they could read it, but it was a little bit away from them while they were holding the child and the driver, and just look there. And it's also led to other considerations for us, like are there things that we can put on the tablet while the distraction is ongoing that may engage the child and take their eye or their mind off of what's going on, that would ultimately then make it more simple for the parents as well.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. All right. Thank you, everybody. This was really informative. I learned a lot. I hope everyone else did as well.